Dear guests, we are very delighted. The College of Arts, the University of Basra, is delighted and honored to host this talk. Today's presenter is Dr. Mustapha Al-Taybi. He is one of the prominent translation and interpreting scholars. He is also a professional teacher, experienced translator and interpreter. He is also accredited author and editor. He is an associate professor of interpreting and translation at Western Sydney and editor-in-chief of translation and interpreting the International Journal of Translation and Interpreting Research. He conducted a number of studies on community interpreting and translation. His recent publications include community translation, translating for community, multi-cultural health translation, and translating culture. Today's talk is very interesting as it focuses on the relationship between trans and culture, focusing particularly on, as I think, the human agent who are the interpreters and translators as cultural mediators. So please join me to welcome Dr. Mustapha Al-Taybi. Dr. Mustapha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jassim, for the introduction. تحياتي لأهل العراق. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله.
وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله.
شكرا جزيلا لاستضافتكم. سعيد باللقاء مع الأساتذة الزملاء والطلبة والطالبات العراقيين. The title of today's presentation is Translating Cultures, and this is actually taken from a recent publication by David Kattan and myself, Translating Cultures, an Introduction for Translators, Interpreters, and Mediators. The book, as you can tell from the title, focuses on translating cultures, that say, on communication of meanings across language and cultural divides. And when we say language and cultural divides, we mean those linguistic and cultural differences that might present challenges for translators and interpreters. And when we say cultural challenges, of course, we can think of different levels, different types of cultural difference that can go from rituals and ceremonies to the way we organize our lives, the way we perceive the world around us, and the way we communicate about the world around us. In this book, translation and interpreting are understood as a kind of intercultural communication, and if you like, mediation as well. As you can see here, I've put mediation between quotes because, as I'm going to explain in the presentation, there is some confusion around this concept. So I will be using mediation without quotes when I refer to mediation as an occupation or a profession, and mediation between quotes when I refer to the process of mediating between cultures and languages as part of our work as translators and interpreters. The nature and extent of mediation is problematic, as we're going to see in this presentation, which requires a contextualized understanding. The key message in this presentation is that a contextualized understanding of cultural mediation and cultural relationships and also the setting where translation and interpreting takes place is essential to understand the extent of cultural mediation or translator intervention that is possible in each case and context. So let's start with 3 quotes about the relationship between culture and interpreting and translation, or about the central position of culture in our work as translators and interpreters. The first one is from Sandra Hale, a scholar who is famous for her publications on legal interpreting in particular. She says that language and culture are intertwined, and accurate interpreting cannot be achieved at the basic word level. Words in interaction only take on meaning according to context, situation, participants, and culture. We would think that this has become axiomatic now, that the presence of, or the central position of culture in interpreting and translation has become commonly accepted, and I guess no professional translator or interpreter would conceive of their work as purely linguistic, because the cultural component will always be there, and as we translate, as we communicate, as we interpret, we also interpret messages according to their cultural context, and also according to the context where they are going to be received. The second quote is from someone you know very well, Professor Hatim and his co-author Mason, who say the translator has not only a bilingual ability, but also a bicultural vision. Translators mediate between cultures, including ideologies, moral systems, and socio-political structures, seeking to overcome those incompatibilities which stand in the way of transfer of meaning. As you can see here, the expectation is that translators would need to be bicultural and would mediate between cultures. So as you can see in both quotations so far, translators are expected to play an intercultural communication role and, of course, need to demonstrate bicultural knowledge and skills. The last quote is from the work of Anthony Pym, who says, and this in relation to training programs to translator and interpreter education. He says, in short, our training programs should progressively be oriented to the production of intercultural mediators. People are able to do rather than just translate. So rather than just translate would be understood in the traditional sense of translating, which is simply converting texts from one language into another. And here refers to production of intercultural mediators, that is, say, translation and interpreting agents who are aware of their intercultural communication role and therefore are able to go beyond the mere action of translating words or translating sentences or mediating just at the linguistic level. Now, I'll excuse me. I'll go through a couple of examples of cultural mediation. If you think of literary translation, for example, we can find translated literature, translated novels, translated short stories, for example, where there is a level of domestication or cultural adaptation. Let's say you have a novel by Najib Mahfouz, and there is a constant reference to types of Egyptian food, Egyptian rituals and ceremonies, religious, social, etc. There might be references to proverbs, to idiomatic expressions, etc. Things that are culturally specific to Egypt or to the Arab world in general. An English translator or a French translator who adapts this work to their a new audience would be engaging, of course, in a type of mediation. This doesn't mean that only those translators who opt for a domesticating approach will be mediating between cultures, but also those who opt for foreignization as a strategy or as a dominant strategy in their translation would also be engaging in mediation. Even, for example, when they choose to leave culture-specific references as they occur in the original and provide, for example, footnotes or parenthetical explanations. Another example of cultural mediation, this time in interpreting, not translation, is our pragmatic interpretation or functional interpretation of cultural specific expressions. Let's take greetings as an example. When in community interpreting, for example, when the public service provider and the client first meet and are about to start their interview, well, they can exchange greetings, and greetings we know are culture specific. This doesn't mean that the interpreter is going to reproduce greetings literally, like Assalamu alaikum, etc. But they are going to use a pragmatic equivalent or a cultural equivalent for that greeting. And when they do so, they will be mediating between one culture and another based on what they know about culture A and what they know about culture B. The same for good wishes, the same for thanking, advising, etc. Let's say in your Iraqi dialect, when someone says "Yarhamallah waldik" or "Arhamallah waldik," and we also say it in Morocco, "La yarham al-walidin," that simply means thank you, and an interpreter would be aware of the pragmatic meaning of this expression and would be able to culturally mediate to render the message appropriately. So rather than literal translation of those expressions, the interpreter would engage in some sort of cultural mediation. And the same applies to swear words or taboo. And this applies especially in community interpreting contexts where conversations can get heated and people sometimes do use swear words. And the cultural mediator role of an interpreter, in some contexts, of course, not all, would consist of, let's say, mitigating those swear words in the form of euphemistic expressions. I'm not saying that this applies across the board. I'm not saying that this needs to apply in all contexts, but this is just an example of what might happen at this level of pragmatic interpretation and cultural mediation. Now, the problem arises when we start looking at the details of what we mean by cultural mediation. What I've given you are just examples of types of mediation or situations where interpreters and translators can mediate. But the concept of mediation is so vague in the literature and also in common usage, especially when we look at another figure which exists especially in some European countries like Belgium, Spain, and Italy, which is the cultural mediator as, let's say, as a separate job, not as an interpreter, not as a translator. The confusion arises because we have this figure in those countries and probably in others as well. And when you look at the job description or the expectations of this cultural mediator, you can find, well, some overlap with the role of interpreters and additional duties and expectations which go beyond the role of a translator and interpreter. So, looking at some publications on the role of cultural mediators in Europe, well, we can start from a quote by Raga Jimeno from Spain, who says that a cultural mediator contributes to improving the communication of foreigners, especially migrants from developing countries, the local community in general, and with public service professionals in particular. If you look at this kind of definition and compare it with the definition of community interpreters, you will find a lot of overlap. But, excuse me. But when you look at the details of the roles associated with or expected of a cultural mediator of this kind, you will find that cultural mediators are expected to work or to act as cultural brokers who mediate in conflicts and misunderstandings, especially when those misunderstandings are based on or related to cultural differences between migrants in Belgium, for example, and public service providers. These cultural mediators act or may act as advocates for ethnic minority members. So here, their role extends beyond facilitating communication, beyond interpreting for their clients. They can also provide support. They can also provide support to these clients, and may be expected to provide cultural advice, let's say cultural advice on the background of the clients who are being interviewed, and also generally about the cultural issues that might face certain groups, let's say Moroccans in Belgium, Chinese, the Chinese community in Spain, and so on and so forth. Well, what this tells us, at least, is that there is some overlap between the figure of cultural mediator and interpreter, and there might be confusion as well when you compare the two figures and the two roles. If we look back at the expectations of a cultural mediator as a job, as an occupation, and then look at the professional codes of ethics of translators and boundaries, of course, we will find a significant mismatch. We will find a big contradiction between what those cultural mediators do and what the professional codes of ethics of translators and interpreters expect us to do. If we take just one example from our local or national codes of ethics here, we find that interpreters and translators maintain clear boundaries between their task as facilitators of communication through message transfer, and any tasks that may be undertaken by other parties involved in the assignment. Practitioners do not, in the course of their interpreting or translation duties, engage in other tasks such as advocacy, guidance, or advice. So here, the codes of ethics, the Australian codes of ethics for translators and interpreters, clearly outlines the boundaries between interpreting and the kind of cultural mediation that we have just referred to in relation to cultural mediators, or the figure of cultural mediators in some European countries. Now, we need to sort out this confusion. We need to clarify the confusion between what is the role of interpreters and translators on one hand, and the role of cultural mediators on the other. And here, I always find Franz Pötschacker's book chapter on the topic very useful and insightful, because Pötschacker provides, clarifies the concept of, or the different meanings of mediation and clarifies the boundaries between what an interpreter is and what a cultural mediator is, and also explains the kind of cultural mediation that takes place in translation and interpreting. He says, the act of mediating in interpreting, and to some extent it applies to translation as well, always involves a cognitive aspect, a cultural linguistic aspect, and a contractual aspect. And mediation is therefore set in the overlapping contexts of conceptual, intercultural, as well as social relations. And this is illustrated in the following figure, where we can see mediating in interpreting and translation sitting between contractual or the contractual type of mediation, the cognitive type of mediation, and the cultural linguistic level of mediation. At the cognitive level, we simply mean the kind of mediation that goes through our minds when we understand messages in a source language and interpret them or translate them into a different language. So the simple fact of, let's say, processing messages or information from one language to another is a kind of mediation. You might know, you might have heard that Juha joke that says that Juha's wife reports that he laid an egg, and then the second person reports it as 2 eggs, then the next person as 10, the fourth person as 50, and then by the end of the day, Juha arrives back home and he hears the rumor as well and ends up reporting it as 100 eggs. Well, that's just a funny example that illustrates the kind of mediation that may take place in our mind when we receive a message and we report it to others. Well, I don't mean that this is exactly what happens in translation and interpreting, but the idea is that our minds are a kind of filter, and as such, they engage in a kind of mediation whenever we receive messages from one person or from one text and render them to another person or in another text. The cultural level, the cultural and linguistic level of mediation consists of adapting our messages or the messages we're working with to a different linguistic system and a different cultural context. While the contractual aspect of mediation is quite different. Here, it relates to the social relationships between different parties, between different stakeholders. In community interpreting, where you have the presence of at least 2 parties plus the interpreter, you have social relationships that the interpreter needs to manage. And the most important part of this figure is the notion contractual mediation, the mediation of social relations, which clearly distinguishes between the role of interpreters and the role of cultural mediators, as explained earlier, because cultural mediators, as I mentioned, are expected to resolve conflicts or at least prevent conflicts and deal with cultural misunderstandings when they arise. Interpreters generally are not expected to do that. So interpreters and translators mediate mainly at the level of, at the cognitive and cultural linguistic level, and there is some minimal level of contractual or social relations mediation, but will generally not go beyond that and, let's say, offer solutions, offer advice, or offer advocacy services for their clients. In the last part of this presentation, I'm going to focus mainly on mediation in interactional communication, that is to say, mediation in interpreting, and more specifically, mediation in community settings or dialogue interpreting in general, simply because this is a site of much more, potentially the site of much more cultural mediation than in translation and than in other types of interpreting, such as conference interpreting. Okay, let's start with one more quote from Perchacker, who says, "Every interpreter is a mediator between languages and cultures, but not every mediator is an interpreter." This provides some clarity in relation to the overlap and confusion I mentioned earlier. So this should make it clear that every interpreter is a mediator if we understand mediation between inverted commas as a kind of process of converting messages from one language into another, and in this process taking into consideration the cultural differences between one culture and another, and the necessary cultural adaptations that need to occur in order to ensure successful communication. But not every mediator is an interpreter. If we go back to the cultural mediator as described by Raga Jimeno and Verrept, for example, we would definitely draw a clear line between that role and the role of an interpreter. In interactional communication or dialogue situations in general, perhaps there is much more need for cultural mediation, simply because, as I said, we don't only have static texts that we need to translate from one language to another, but we also have actual human beings present with us in a courtroom, at a police station, at a healthcare consultation, etc., etc. And interactional communication is even more complex because, because of the very fact of being interactional, which means that it starts at a point, develops, and concludes finally. And during the whole process, there is give and take. There are messages produced by at least two parties, and each message builds on the previous one, and the two main parties continue interacting throughout the consultation or interview. And when we speak about interactional communication, we can think of a lot aspects where cultures differ. To take just a few examples, direct and indirect communication. We know that some cultures are high context and others are low context. Some cultures are more direct, relatively more direct than others in asking for favors, in asking questions, in responding to requests, etc., etc. So the interpreter will always need to be aware of these cultural subtleties and differences and act accordingly, which is not always easy. Cultures also differ in terms of the level of involvement required or tolerated in conversation or in interaction. There are some cultures that are okay with more involvement, that say interruption, overlap, etc., which means interest, which is normally interpreted as interest in the conversation, a person being keen to participate, a person being keen to make a contribution to the development of the conversation. While in other cultures, there are strict rules of turn-taking rules, and there is an expectation that each one of the participants will wait for the other person to finish talking before they answer a question or before they make their own contribution. So here, the work of interpreters would definitely extend beyond rendering messages, because they will need to manage interactions between the two parties, especially in some settings, as I'm going to illustrate shortly. The same applies to Grice's maxims, for example, the expectation that people will be cooperative, the expectation that people will say as much as necessary, people will communicate coherently and clearly. This doesn't apply across cultures, and because of the fact that it doesn't apply across cultures, there will be moments in the conversation, in the interview, where there is tension, where the expectations of one party are not met. The interpreter might need to interfere there as a cultural mediator. And the same can be said about nonverbal communication and silence. Still talking about cultural mediation and the requirements and challenges of interactional communication, especially in those settings that are commonly referred to as dialogue settings or community or public service. We have different views in the literature. Well, perhaps starting from Wadenschow's work in 1998. Wadenschow was one of the first scholars to, and Roy before her as well. They were among the first scholars to point out that interpreting, especially in dialogue situations, does not only consist of rendering messages, but involves a lot of participants, a lot of, let's say, conversation management or interaction management. Other authors like Mason and Wren describe a more active role of interpreters, including the possibility for interpreters to make suggestions in relation to the interaction, how to organize it, for example, to intervene, to explain cultural differences when such cultural differences arise, when there is a misunderstanding between the two parties. They also say that interpreters can encourage a party to take a speech turn, and this applies especially in relation to what I said earlier, in relation to speech turns, turn taking. In some cultures, especially when the participant comes from, let's say, a vulnerable background, they're reluctant to take a turn, they're reluctant to participate in a conversation, they're reluctant to ask questions. And here, what the authors suggest is that the interpreter needs to take an active role in order to encourage to ask questions or to participate in the interview or conversation. Also engage in small talk with one or both parties, that's the interpreter doing this, and decide not to interpret part of the content, especially in those situations where the content might be impolite or threatening for the other party. Well, if we go back to the OSIT Code of Conduct, you will agree that all these, let's say, interventions and parts of the role of the interpreter role wouldn't be warranted, simply because according to most of the code of ethics, interpreters are expected to limit their intervention to understanding and rendering messages, making suggestions in relation to the interaction, intervening to explain cultural differences, encouraging a party to answer a question or to take a turn would be excluded. But we need to be aware that this literature does exist, and there are different views on the role of interpreters, especially in relation to cultural mediation. But in general, we need to be aware of the differences between one context and another, between one setting and another. Because what happens is that some authors are referring to business interpreting, some authors are referring to healthcare interpreting, others refer to court interpreting. And of course, the rules and expectations are not the same across these different settings. What David Catan and myself do in this book, Translating Cultures, is argue for a contextualized understanding of mediation. That is to say, an understanding of mediation and the extent of mediation that translators and interpreters can engage in, depending on the type of translation at hand, and depending on the interpreting context and communicative situation we're called to work in. This contextualized understanding of mediation draws a clear distinction between some types of settings, which I call here collaborative public service settings. Collaborative in the sense that the general mood and tone of the interaction or the interview is cooperative between the two parties, between the healthcare provider and the patient. Let's say the main focus is on the health condition or the health issue the patient has, and both parties exchange information with a view to resolving the problem, to finding a solution to the condition. The communication is normally cooperative. There is rarely, let's say, any tension between the two parties. Of course, it can happen, but generally speaking, we think of a cooperative, collaborative interaction between professional and client. The same can be said about educational settings and social services settings, where the main focus is on helping the client, on offering services, on offering advice, and so on. So here, in such contexts, it may be more acceptable for interpreters to, let's say, to show more involvement or to show more intervention in the form of interactional management, for example, or in the form of intercultural adaptation of messages and communication styles, especially if we look at communication styles like directness and indirectness, like politeness, form, and so on and so forth. We can probably say the same thing about business interpreting, especially when the parties involved, each one of the parties involved, employs their own interpreter. In this case, the interpreter will be working for the employer, will be working for the company that hires him or her. And if, let's say, we have a business encounter between two representatives and we have two interpreters, each one of them representing or working for one of the parties, the expectation, the impartiality expectation would be less applicable here than in courts, for example, or police interviews. Yeah, courts and police settings would be the other extreme. These settings, because of, let's say, the real life implications of the interactions, they have more constraints. The role of interpreters there is more limited to renditions of messages, of interpreting or translation of messages. And some court officials might even think that interpreters are expected to just reproduce sentences or utterances word for word, which is of course misunderstanding, misconception in relation to interpreting. Well, having distinguished between different settings, especially in for community interpreting and business interpreting, there will always be a fine line that the interpreter will need to deal with. Because in general, in the literature, you will find that that interpreters are expected to take into consideration the linguistic differences between the two languages and also the cultural differences between the two parties or the two clients. They are expected to act functionally and pragmatically, that is say, render messages in a meaningful way and in a way that captures the intended meaning rather than the words. So this would be acceptable and expected in different settings, even within court settings, which are more stringent. Even Sandra Hale, one of the authors who argue for a strictly neutral and impartial role for interpreters, because she focuses on court interpreting. Even Hale agrees that a pragmatic interpretation of speech acts, of utterances, is acceptable, not only acceptable, but also required. But she also points out that cultural differences are not just differences in speech acts, how we express thanks, how we express apologies, how we ask questions, etc., etc. Cultural differences include a lot of other levels, a lot of other types of difference, including beliefs, including ideologies, including rituals, including social relationships, and so on and so forth. Which means that interpreters, as I said, will always face a dilemma and a fine line between that is, say, in relation to how much intervention or how much cultural mediation they can do. As Hale herself says, there's a fine line between ensuring accuracy and overstepping the mark by offering too much information that may go beyond the interpreter's role. And again, what we understand by interpreter's role varies from one cultural background to another, varies from one setting to another, and varies even among interpreting scholars as well. Dealing with this dilemma that interpreters often face, translators probably to a lesser extent, what we argue in translating cultures, as I said, is that there needs to be a contextualized understanding of our role, a contextualized understanding of the setting or the communicative situation where we are. Sorry.
Go ahead, Dr. Mustafa.
I've just received a message saying that the host would like you to unmute, but I wasn't muted. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. All right. Well, the fine line I was referring to is a problem for interpreters, perhaps to a lesser extent to translators. And going back to the examples I mentioned earlier in terms of differences between one culture and another, you can think of a lot of situations and a lot of cultural differences, let's say between the Chinese and the Australians, between Australians and Spanish clients, for example. And this can be reflected at a number of levels. I mentioned earlier politeness, I mentioned directness and indirectness. We mentioned the concept of speech acts, etc. And to give you just one example that is reported by Spencer, Oti, and Ching, how interpreters are expected to deal with implicit messages. I said earlier that some cultures are more high context than others, which means that they rely heavily on, let's say, contextual cues. They expect the addressee to interpret their message according to the context, and they might say very little, expecting or counting on the addressee to understand their intended message based on the situation where they're communicating. Whereas in other cultural contexts, including the Australian context here and the English-speaking cultural groups in general, the expectation is that communication needs to be as clear and explicit as possible. So what does an interpreter do? Let's say a business interpreter or a community interpreter, what does an interpreter do in such situations where a client offers minimal information, offers very little information, or sends out implicit messages? To what extent the interpreter can make those messages more explicit? Of course, this will depend on the context. Again, there is a big difference between police and court interpreting on one hand, and healthcare or social services interviews on the other. In this book, we understand, as do other scholars, of course, that translators and interpreters do mediate between cultural groups, not only between languages, but the extent of intervention, the extent of their, let's say, agency will depend on the type and setting of interpreting or translation. I'm aware of the time. We still have 10 minutes for the questions and comments, but I just wanted to conclude with one quote from the book Translating Cultures, where we say, there will always be areas of uncertainty, but a qualified and informed interpreter will be able to make decisions based on their cultural, linguistic, and general knowledge, their professional code of ethics, and their on-the-spot assessment of the situation. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mustafa, for raising these insightful ideas. And I think our audience, students, colleagues will benefit from these contributions. I'm aware that you have underlined the role of culture on mediation, that mediation is culturally variant, let's say. I think the perception of a mediator in Australia, of translators and interpreters as mediators in Australia, may vary from that in Iraq, for example, at particular periods of time or at certain places, specifically at zones of conflict. And I can see that you have also focused on this anthropological, let's say, and understanding. You focus on the positive, let's say, aspects of translation and interpreting in general. And you have hinted to the agency of translators and interpreters. They can intervene from time to time. As you know, there is, you know, with the sociological turn, there is a very much, let's say, emphasis on the agency of translators and interpreters as interventionist, as Monday says, or as Susan Bassnett also calls them, as manipulators, and sometimes at zones of conflict as traitors, as let's say spies or coordinators, or as agents of the occupation. As far as community interpreting is concerned, can all these aspects be present at the same time within the same, let's say, cultures? Mediation, that is to say, bridging the gap, the cultural and the linguistic gap, as well as sometimes intervening in order to feed certain ideologies and so on. Can all these be present within the same context, or can vary from place to place and culture to culture?
Thank you for this comment and question, Dr. Jassim. I think it varies a lot depending on where you're working. First, let's say the cultural context. The cultural and national context, and by this I mean whether there is an established profession, whether there is an established professional body, and whether there is commonly accepted codes of ethics. So, for example, here in Australia, it is very, very difficult to even to mention the role of the interpreter or translator as an agent, simply because we're bound by the Aussie Code of Ethics and Code of Practice, which clearly expects translators and interpreters to act as mere, let's say, professionals who render messages rather than anything else. Whether you're working as a translator or as an interpreter, you're limited in terms of role and expectations to understanding the intended meaning in the text or in the interaction and rendering it into the other language without further intervention, without further agency. But of course, if you compare this with a country where the situation is different, you will find that expectations will be different as well, especially what you have just mentioned in relation to war zones. Military conflicts, I've never worked in military conflicts, but I understand that the situation is quite different, and especially when there is a war going on in your country and you see that civilians are targeted or civilians go through very, very extenuating circumstances, it's difficult for interpreters to maintain their neutrality and impartiality. We've seen this in reports about interpreting in Afghanistan, interpreting in Yemen, and also in Iraq. So I would say that it depends. I mean, it varies a lot from one country to another. And as I suggested throughout the presentation, it also depends on the kind of setting where the interpreting takes place. There's a significant difference between some settings and others, depending on how much is at stake, what is at stake, and how much is at stake. So that's my my understanding. And if you look at the literature, the existing literature in relation to the role of interpreters, you can also find some at least slight differences between let's say Western literature and Asian literature. If you read papers about business interpreting by some Japanese and Chinese authors, you will find that they expect more intervention in terms of cultural mediation and also intervention at the level of facilitating communication between the parties. For example, they would suggest that Japanese business people are sometimes too shy to intervene, too shy to ask questions, in which case they suggest that the interpreter should encourage them and play that role of cultural mediator or facilitator as well.
Thank you, Dr. Mustafa. We can sense, you know, as translators, now we feel relaxed when we listen to your ideas and the constructive roles that we can play in societies. In contrary, there are, you know, emerging studies at the present time which suspect the role of translators and interpreters, and these suspicions may generate or push people to put lives at risk of translators and interpreters. So the approach that you are now dealing with, that you are reflecting, is very constructive and builds the or conveys significantly the role or the role that we play in societies, how to bridge cultural linguistic gaps between people of different tongues. So this is credited for you. This is the first time that maybe in 3 or 4 years that I listened to a talk that embraces, that let's say applauds the role of translators and interpreters, not to, let's say, suspect their position as, let's say, message destroyers, as interventionists, as agents for the, let's say, the other, let's say, political party or the other culture. We are so grateful, Dr. Mustafa, and we have been, let's say, very moved by your ideas. We know that it is the early morning and you need to take sometimes some rest. So I like to finish by this, by let's say, transforming the colleges, the students' gratitudes for you, first for accepting our invitation, and second for enforcing, for let's say, feeding our minds, our conceptions of the constructive roles that we need to emphasize on as translators and interpreters. So thank you very much, Dr. Mustafa, and we are very eager to meet you in similar occasions in the future.
My pleasure, Dr. Al-Mariani. Thank you very much for the invitation once more. It's been a pleasure to join you and your students and colleagues, and I look forward to more exchanges between us. الله يبارك فيكم ويوفقكم وتبقوا على خير إن شاء الله.
إن شاء الله. شكرا جزيلا دكتور، نورتنا. الله يسلمكم دكتور.
مع السلامة. على خير.
مع السلامة دكتورنا الغالي. مع السلامة، في أمان الله دكتور. مع السلامة.